Hello and welcome to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tarundu Amarasekara. Our focus today is on the very timely topic of capital markets. Businesses around the world, especially in Sri Lanka too, are looking at ways of getting on in the action of the capital markets and trying to see how they could fund their future growth. Investors too are looking at what can they do in order to maximize their returns on these very dynamic capital markets. The boom of one market thrills us in the morning, while the bust of another tends to send shivers down our spine. How does one really balance their portfolios, and most importantly, what are the developments in the capital markets that one needs to know about? This is our focus today on Bisnomics, and joining me for this very insightful discussion is the president of the CFA Society Sri Lanka, Dinesh Warusawithana. Dinesh, welcome to Bisnomics.
Thank you, Tarindu, for inviting me for the program. My
pleasure. Pleasure is always ours, Dinesh. Thank you for accepting it. Dinesh, let's talk about the Sri Lankan capital markets. Now, given the tough conditions of our economy, can we truly expect our capital markets to be a success? Because the economic indicators are not looking good.
Yes. Yes, Tarindu. So, if you look at the role of capital markets in the economy, it is a way to channel the savings from the people who are saving to the investors who needs the funds for investment.
From surplus to deficit.
For surplus deficit, yes. And if you look at the current context, even despite the challenging conditions, we have seen some IPOs happening this year, and by and far they have been successful.
And oversubscribed in big ways.
Exactly. So, but having said that, it is still difficult to expect continued strong performance in the near term from capital markets in the context of the tough challenges both globally as well as locally in Sri Lanka. So, you will see that our corporate earnings have seen a strong rebound in the first quarter of this year, and valuation still remains quite attractive compared to the peer averages in the region. However, there are certain concerns among investors about the macro situation, and until these concerns goes away, Sri Lanka's ability to attract some funds to Sri Lanka is challenging, and this will be a short-term challenge. But if you take a long-term perspective,
and I believe in any business we need to look at the long term, isn't it?
Exactly. So, capital markets by definition is where you source funds for long term investments.
Correct.
So, in that perspective, for long term investors, there are several fundamentally strong companies even today that are trading at historically low valuations, which are a good buy in the long term. So, I think the capital markets still offer good opportunities for such investors.
Dinesh, I believe what you are trying to say is don't try to go by the trend, or don't try to just follow the trend all the time. Do your research, isn't it?
Exactly.
Am I right?
Exactly. You should look at the fundamentals, do your research, and be guided by your research, not by the trend.
Because we sometimes see people, just because so many people are buying, known people are buying, they tend to go and dump their money into a stock. And of course, when it gets overheated and overblown, and when the correction happens, they call it a drop, but I believe the correct word is a correction.
Exactly.
Yes, when the correction happens, they blame the market. Do you see this problem as well?
Definitely. But that's the problem in the market to a large extent, because people want to make quick money, like you said, and they get carried away by the trend.
Market is not a casino.
It's definitely not a casino. It's a place for long-term investors. So, you need to do your research, select your stocks, and also, like you mentioned earlier, look at a portfolio approach to diversify your risks.
So, when you look at diversifying the risk, let's talk about that a little bit more. I know this is one of your specialities as well, and you are a very sound research oriented person, I know that. When a company or when an individual is looking at investing, what are the things they should look into in terms of their research, or when they're trying to understand how risky or how rewarding this particular stock or this particular instrument could be? What should you be looking at as a part of your research, Dinesh?
Yes. So, particularly first you should look at yourself and your risk tolerance limit.
Risk appetite.
Risk appetite. Basically, broadly a younger person who's just coming into the job market will have a longer holding period, and he could take a bit more risk compared to a person who's just about to enter retirement. So that's one factor.
Nice comparison. I like that.
Yeah, thank you. And so then based on that to decide, okay, how much of money you could invest in long-term instruments such as equities versus how much you can invest in short-term instruments such as fixed income in securities. So then based on that, you can select what are the stocks you want to invest. And there also you should again do your research and look to build a diversified portfolio of investments. So without putting all your eggs in one basket, let's spread out the risks, because even today there are so many good companies which you could pick up at very low valuations.
Absolutely.
And hold it for the long term, and it's quite a good
Companies
proposition.
where the fundamentals are strong, though they may not be trending.
Exactly.
Yes, this is not social media where you go with the trend. You have to go with the research, as you very
Exactly.
correctly said.
So,
Let's talk about the current forex situation. Now, when you talk about the capital markets, we have to think about the forex situation as well. Dinesh, things are not looking good. I believe we are at an all-time low with regard to forex. We are down to the last 4 billion, and exports are challenged. Tourism is almost at a zero right now. Things are not looking that good. So why do you think, I mean, is this not a sign that we are having lesser, from an investment side, is this not a sign that we are having lesser and lesser depleting levels of foreign capital investments into this country?
yeah. So increasing the level of FDIs into the country has been a challenge for a number of years. And in the current context of the global pandemic, it's difficult to expect a change in the near term. And also the current challenges what you mentioned have been exacerbated due to the severe impact the COVID has had on our two key foreign exchange earning sectors, that is tourism and remittances. So as you know, these two sectors are the largest foreign exchange earners for the country.
Correct.
And
I believe remittances mainly because some of the foreign workforce had to return back due to being laid off or due to the aggravating situation in their countries, like in the Gulf, for example, they had to come back.
yeah. So at the moment, numbers haven't shown a steep decline, is still holding, but it could have been better if things were better
But
globally.
tourism really went down.
Tourism has got
Zero.
severely impacted. Yeah, it's a very minimal inflow this year. So because of this, the government, as you know, has been compelled to take a couple of temporary measures to manage the situation. This is not an ideal situation, but it's necessary in the current context, because government need to prioritize certain priorities of the country, and we as citizens, I think we need to abide by these measures.
But Dinesh, don't you also think there's another problem in the fact that now already sometimes there are certain agreements that have been entered into, and some banks which had kind of opened letters of credit, they had to go back on their word because of some of these policy developments.
Yeah.
Don't you think it kind of puts a black mark on our entire banking system as well?
Yes, so there are definitely some short-term challenges, but I'm sure all our counterparties also understand the pressures we are facing, and at the same time certain measures have been put in place by the government, and uses certain banks accessing foreign funding to alleviate those pressures. So I'm sure in the near term certain measures will be taken, and then the current restrictions will be lifted soon. But I think beyond that, we need to look at the medium to long term.
Correct.
I
I think what we discussed was more like the plaster on the wound,
exactly.
whereas it's not a long-term
It's not
cure.
a remedy, yeah. So we need to look beyond this to see how we fundamentally improve the position. So for that, of course, there's only two ways possible. That is, we need to improve our FDI inflows to Sri Lanka. And to improve FDIs, we need to have big enough projects which are attractive for foreign investors, because they need scale. And that's the type of investors we need coming into the country, not just short-term investors. So the execution of the portfolio execution of the Port City project will be a catalyst, and I'm sure that will attract a lot of investor interest, and that will help us to mobilize a lot of FDI into Sri Lanka.
Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the capital markets. What kind of impact did you see? Because we see the interest rates being slashed, which is definitely a boon to the capital markets because people tend to invest more. But at the same time, there is also the problem where in terms of the banks are trying to give this money on loans for more and more investment purposes, but people are being cautious. How have you seen this dynamics playing out?
Yes, definitely the COVID-19 has had a negative impact on capital markets globally as well as Sri Lanka. However, if you look back, capital markets have shown a remarkable resilience to recover from these crises. The last big crisis all of us know is the global financial crisis.
GFC 2008.
GFC, exactly. And in few years the markets recovered and continue to thrive. So when it comes to investors in the stock market in Sri Lanka, like I mentioned earlier, you need to look at a long-term view and take a long-term perspective and look at the underlying fundamentals as well as the corporate governance of these companies. Do your research and take professional advice, or if not, use the services of a fund management company, like going to a unit trust where these professional services are available to you. If you invest these under these circumstances, you are bound to be successful in the long term. And even though we are in the midst of a pandemic creating many challenges, it also opens up many opportunities to us. Today you can purchase fundamentally good stocks, like I mentioned, at historically low valuations.
Correct.
So these are opportunities which were not available previously. So if you are a long-term investor, you can take advantage of these opportunities, of course, by balancing your risks.
I need to ask you this because this is a discussion regarding capital markets and the currency markets as well.
Yeah.
There's a big focus towards historic high levels of currency printing taking place in Sri Lanka. Dinesh, explain to us, what does this really mean?
Yeah, so basically, if you look at most countries, including in the region, they have been extending a fiscal stimulus to stimulate the economy, to balance the negative impact of the COVID impact. So as you know, unless
call this, I believe, QE, quantitative easing,
yes,
ease out the
exactly
the money stress in the economy.
Yes, because unless there's demand in the economy, the supply side will not function. If the supply side doesn't function, then the people will not get paid. So it's in the interest of everybody to keep the economy moving, and for this reason, a lot of governments, including the government of Sri Lanka, has been having various fiscal stimuluses.
And to do this, they keep on the printing of the money.
Yes, so this is like a temporary phenomena until the crisis is over.
But it does devalue the currency, isn't it?
It would
because the inflations are now more than 5%
exactly,
for the month of June, 5.2%.
Exactly. So this is not something you can do indefinitely. For a limited period under limited conditions, you could do it.
What are the developments in a digital space taking place in capital markets? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. The capital market status quo of Sri Lanka. That is our focus today on Bisnomics. I'm Tharundu Amarasekara, and joining me for this discussion is the president of the CFA Society of Sri Lanka, Dinesh Warusawithana. Dinesh, let's talk about the impact of digital. We saw the stock exchange going digital overnight, and today we see so many people active on digital channels as well. What are your thoughts? Fascinating times, isn't it?
This is indeed fascinating times, Tarindu, and that's something which we should have hopefully done earlier, but it's better late than never.
Absolutely.
If the stock exchange and the infrastructure was in place previously to go digital, we would have been wouldn't have been necessary to close the market. And today, thanks to that experience, everybody has developed, and we are able to do everything digitally.
And some of these apps are, I think, among the most downloaded apps in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, it's one of the most popular apps, and Sri Lankans, as you know, are very innovative, and they have developed state-of-the-art apps which allows you a lot of functionality. So those apps I would say are on par with some of the apps you would see in other developed markets. So in technology terms, we were right there in forefront. Even way back when the Colombo Stock Exchange started computerizing, we had the best technology at that time. So it's natural that we regain that edge with technology.
Let's talk about the debt market, the bond market. Now, bond sounds a fancy term if you're talking about the 007 spy, but when we are talking about the financial bonds, that is, I believe, gets complicated to a certain extent. There's so many factors to consider. Bonds are a very famous way of borrowing. As we all know, you borrow from the market. Dinesh, currently, what is the status of the bond market in Sri Lanka? Both, I want you to bring in both perspectives here, please. The treasury bonds or the government bonds as well as the private sector debentures laid out on the table.
Okay. That's a good dissection of the bond market, Tarindo, because the two markets, the government bond market and the corporate bond market, are at very different stages of development in Sri Lanka. So if you look at the government bond market, it's in a fairly well developed stage. We have government bonds going up to 30 years and fairly good liquidity and transactions happening even up to 5 to 7 year category. However, the issue is with the corporate bond market. The corporate bond market has been around for about 20 years or more. However, the issuances are very limited. By and large, only the financial institutions issue bonds, and the majority of those paper has been issued only up to 5 years. You have only 1 or 2 exceptions which has gone up to 10 years. And
what do you think is the reason? Do you think the private sector doesn't really have faith in the market, or is the market not ready? What's the problem, Dinesh?
It's a good question, because if you look at the current interest rate environment, it is the best time to issue bonds because we have a historically low interest rate environment. So the corporate should ideally be issuing bonds, and
the risk averse would definitely go for it.
Yeah, and mobilizing funds for their long-term investments. The issue is twofold. I think for the corporates, they need to maintain certain requirements to issue bonds because it has to be listed in the Colombo Stock Exchange. They need to adhere to certain continuing listing rules, which I think are good practices to safeguard investor interest.
Good corporate governance is always essential for capital markets.
Yeah, and they need to do quarterly disclosure of financials, which is very essential to ensure there's investor confidence. So some corporates have access to the banking sector, and for them it's easier to go to the bank and borrow rather than going to the capital markets. This is something which needs to change over time. I think corporates should be moved towards the capital markets, particularly for the large corporates who issue or borrow large amounts of money. And when there is supply in the market, the demand will come. So there are institutional investors like the provident funds, the insurance funds, as well as some high net worth individuals who would like to invest in this paper, but they don't see any paper coming to the market.
Correct.
So that's one thing which can be done, and we could also change the regulations to introduce some new classes of securities. Say for example, securitization is something which is not happening in Sri Lanka in the true form which it happens in other markets.
Why do you say so?
Because we need to have a particular legal framework to support securitization. So in a securitization, a special purpose vehicle will be established to carry on a certain project, and this SPV, as we call it, is often in the form of a project company.
Special purpose vehicle.
Yes.
Okay.
And this company will then issue debt for the purpose of carrying out the project.
Okay.
So it's sort of a nice ring fence structure.
And it also kind of protects the mother company, the main
Exactly.
company as well.
Yeah, it protects the sponsors from any risks.
And I believe on the similar lines we see today about the SPACs coming up, that is more from an equity market perspective. Special purpose acquisition companies.
Yes.
Dinesh, now if you look at some of the regional powerhouses as financial hubs, for example, Singapore. Singapore has come an amazing way today. We see so many investment banks are setting up their regional offices in Singapore. It's clearly gone ahead in leaps and bounds compared to Sri Lanka. What lessons can we learn from such a market like Singapore?
Yeah, Singapore is a very good example, which is a country which has come a long way in a very short time. So there are several lessons we could learn from Singapore. So as investors always look at stability, and Singapore has been a stable country, both in terms of security, politically, as well as economically. Then the second thing what investors look for is the level of regulation and whether it's administered effectively. And again, Singapore has come on top of that. And of course, another area what investors look for is the tax environment and what's your tax rate. So Singapore has a very attractive tax structure as well.
And I believe they've also had policy consistency,
Exactly.
which is
It has
lacking in
been
Sri Lanka.
Policy consistency has been there for a long time. So if you look at Sri Lanka, our government and regulators are going in the right direction. So before anything, we needed to have security. So that's now been achieved, and now we are going towards policy consistency, because for the last few years we have seen some consistency in policy.
But what's the guarantee, Dinesh? I mean, if the government changes, let's say at the next election, because we've seen this every 5 years, the reset button being hit, stopping the previous policies. In fact, some people say that the last proper consistent project that was carried out across governments was the Mahaveli project. Ever since then, it's always been a, like what we call this stopgap approach.
Yeah.
Don't you think that has been really hindering the progress of our economy, not only just capital markets, but overall?
Yes, the policy consistency has overall held the country back, but I think
the policy inconsistency.
Inconsistency. But now I think we are at a level where we can't afford to do that any longer. So we need to have consistent policies going forward, and I believe the regulators and the policymakers now understand that, and they are moving in the correct direction.
And what role does the entities, like for example the Securities and Exchange Commission, what role does it play, Dinesh, in this?
Yes, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the other regulatory bodies have an important role to play in this, and to be fair, they have been playing their role very well. Another thing like what I mentioned earlier was the regulatory environment. So the regulators have done their best. They have adopted the best international practices. So when it comes to, say for example, the accounting treatment in Sri Lanka, we were one of the countries in the region to adopt IFRS accounting first.
International Financial Reporting Standards.
Yes, so that gives a lot of confidence to foreign investors that our accounts are prepared up to international standard.
Understood. Let's talk about the government policy for capital markets. Dinesh, in your perspective, what should be included in a government policy towards developing capital markets? Because especially we live in a world today where a lot of digital concepts are entering the capital markets. For example, cryptocurrency. Yeah. Now we saw very recently some of the top crypto exchanges were blocked by the regulators of London.
Yeah.
And we see China having a huge clampdown and a crackdown on crypto and other associated similar digital currencies. What about the way forward for Sri Lanka? We hear comments that we need to have crypto exchanges coming up, especially in the port city, but at the same time we don't see much of a change towards incorporate these digital developments into our capital markets. Where do you think we stand in that front as well? But first, yes, what should be included in a proper government policy for developing capital markets?
So like we discussed earlier, the first thing government needs to ensure is there's a conducive environment for capital markets. So in this regard, the key thing is to have policy consistency, and that we have discussed earlier, and we see the government and regulators going towards that direction. And we should have a regulatory environment which is on par with what investors see in their home markets. So we have the IFRS accounting, which makes things easier. Then we have the SEC looking at ISCO and implementing those best practices in Sri Lanka. So those are the moves which are happening. But in addition, I believe that government can take some policy action to stimulate the market, to introduce new instruments to fill in the gaps. So, one good thing the government can do is the securitization law. So, to enact a law and make the necessary changes to enable securitization. So, which can allow projects to directly come to the capital market and borrow funds.
So, for example, if company A is doing a project, that project can be securitized.
Yes.
The loan you take for it, and then you could trade that particular
Exactly,
project.
yeah.
Not the company,
Not
but the project.
Yes. For example, a highway project
Yes.
can securitize its future receivables and issue paper to raise the funding required for the project.
Understood.
So, that will ease lot of pressures.
And even some of the borrowing requirements, the over dependency on foreign loans,
Yes.
many of these things can be avoided, isn't it?
Yes. And another thing what the government could do is basically look at the bank lending to corporates. So, when large corporates go to the banking sector to borrow large amounts, they could suggest that, okay, beyond certain amount, you should go to the capital markets. Because this
So,
has
cap the borrowing,
encourage
more equity,
no,
or even debt.
even debt, but from a capital market.
So, like
then
the bond issues.
Exactly. So, then the exposure to the banking sector is also limited. So, it helps to mitigate the risk of both the banking sector and overall the economy as well.
And what about bringing in crypto and all that? Because we don't even hear that capital market discussions on these matters.
Yeah. So, I think in the Sri Lankan context, crypto may be a bit premature. So, we will need to see what other regulators around the world do and then take cue from that.
You think the market is still at a basic stage for that?
Yes, because the regulations have not yet been developed in other major developed countries, and we haven't seen it happening.
Even some of the developed countries seem to be not so sure about
Exactly.
the way forward.
Exactly, because they are also not quite sure. So, unless BIS comes out with some regulations,
Correct.
I think it's better to be cautious and wait it out a bit. And when you talk about boosting capital markets, it's not only the government. There are other people, other stakeholders also has a role to play.
For sure.
So, say for example, if you look at the corporates who are the issuers of paper, who are accessing the capital markets for funding, they also have a significant role to play to develop the market.
We are going to come to that, Dinesh, in more detail.
Okay.
Let's find out about the skills needed to be a finance professional, a capital market professional in today's context. On the other side of this short break, this is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Dinesh Warusawithana regarding the capital market situation of Sri Lanka. Dinesh, before the break we were talking about the role that not only for the government but even the private sector should play in boosting these capital markets. So go ahead, share your thoughts on that.
The private sector also needs to do their part to improve the capital markets because they are the beneficiaries of a well-functioning capital market. So particularly if you look at the corporate governance structures of companies, the financial reporting and investor relation functions, whilst they have improved over time, I think there is still significant scope to improve this even further, to come up to international standards or even regional standards. So, this would also enable the companies to create better investor confidence
for sure
for themselves. And also companies also should look at capital markets rather than overly relying on the banking sector for their funding requirements. And on the other side, retail investors. So, they also need to understand what capital markets is a bit better. They should not go to the capital markets to look for overnight returns.
Don't come with candy coin dreams.
Exactly. They should be able to take a long-term view and wait for the returns to be realized.
Understood. Let's talk about the skills needed now. The modern finance professional, Dinesh, is not the person who sits behind a desk and prepares accounts all day. Today you have robotic softwares to do that. You talk about robotic accounting and we speak about fintech. So the manual arduous work is being taken care of by those technology systems. But what skills do the finance professionals of today need? And most importantly, how important is the network for a finance professional? Whom he knows and who knows him. Let's talk about that.
Very good point, Tarindu. So, due to advances in computing and robotics, we are inundated with information. So, I think this makes the role of a financial professional more important, because we need somebody who will go through all the information and distill the relevant information from the noise and present it to us for decision making. Or in the context of an investment, the professional should be able to identify what are the key drivers of that investment, what are the risks of those investments, and how to mitigate those investments. So, that is where the experience and the network of that investment professional will come to the picture. The more experience or the more broad experience you have and the more broader network you have, you will be able to get more information for your investment decision making and make the right decision, because as you know, the world is an evolving place and technology makes that evolution even faster. So, having all this under your belt will help you stay on top of the game.
And what about the network? How important is the network for a finance professional?
Yeah. So, network is also equally important, because when you make a decision, you should be able to discuss your ideas with other like-minded investors, and the investment opportunity may be too big for you. So, then the best way is to collaborate with other like-minded investors.
And if the risk is too big, you can share the risk.
Exactly. That is the best part of collaboration, where you can share it with many investors. So, if something goes wrong, it does not wipe you out.
For sure.
And also together you can look at much more broader investment opportunities than in the case if you are doing it alone.
Now, a lot of finance professionals who are watching this show, they are always looking out for certain new qualifications to pursue, keep themselves upgraded and updated, because I believe one key part of having professionalism and competence is continuous professional development. They have to keep themselves upgraded and updated. Now, let's talk about the role of CFA. How does CFA contribute towards the capital markets of this country?
Yeah.
Especially with the competencies and the skills of our finance professionals.
Yes. So, CFA is a globally recognized investment management qualification, which is considered to be the highest in the industry. It is a qualification which has been around for over 70 years, and today there are about 170,000 CFA qualified charter holders globally, working in over 162 markets. So, chartered financial analyst is a designation which is given to those who have not only completed the exam, but also collected the necessary professional experience. So, like you mentioned earlier, the experience is also vital in this investment decision making program. And just to give you a bit more about the examination, it is a 3-year exam which has 3 parts. And looks at various parts of the investment decision making process.
Now, at the same time, Dinesh, I believe that accounting outsourcing is nothing new. Sri Lanka has been seen as a destination for outsourcing accounting activities for many decades now. But I believe a much more value-added area of economic potential is the outsourcing of financial analysis work or financial research work. Now, in your perspective, do you see a potential for Sri Lanka to be a research hub for financial analysis? What are your thoughts?
You are very correct there, Tarindu, and Sri Lanka has in fact been a hub for financial research outsourcing. You may have heard of a company called Amber Research.
Yeah, and there are so many other companies as well.
So, that is a company actually which was promoted and started by a couple of CFA charter holders in Sri Lanka, and has gone on to be a world class research outsourcing company, which was recently acquired by Moody's. So, that is one example, and following them there have been a number of other companies which have been established in Sri Lanka.
And today it is not just the companies, isn't it? You see so many platforms where individuals go and list themselves. Just to share my experience with you, one of my friends who was an expert in terms of this financial analysis work, listed the details on one of these job platforms and was hired as a regional CFO, earning easily more than $5,000 a month. I mean, it just goes on to show if you have the right skill, you definitely have a chance. And I believe financial analysis and financial analysis related research is a highly valued activity which Sri Lankans, given our advantage in the communication and also given our analysis capabilities, we definitely would be able to provide that value to the rest of the world. Yeah. Do you think so?
Definitely, because if you look at the CFA program in Sri Lanka, the CFA Society, we have been in existence for about 20 years, and currently each year about 40 charter holders pass out, and we see a similar number of charter holders migrating overseas to take advantages of the opportunities what you mentioned.
So financial analysis is a field where there is global opportunities.
Yes, global opportunities in addition to the local opportunities.
On a final note, Dinesh, I want to touch upon the financial crimes, or in other words, what we call as these white collar crimes, because we all know about the bond scam, we all know about so many other financial crimes that happen, and sometimes it's still happening as well. What can be done? I'm asking not with regard to a qualification, but as professionals, as maybe the government, what can be really done in order to control these financial crimes? Because let's admit it, one single, no matter how much minute it may be, one single financial crime is like a bit of dirt that drops into a very nice clear glass of milk. It becomes tainted completely. What can be really done in order to minimize or eliminate these crimes from taking place in capital markets?
Yeah. So you are very correct, Tarindo, because a financial crime has the potential to disillusion people with the financial.
Take the confidence of the investor.
Take the confidence, kill the confidence. And sadly, we have seen it happening in Sri Lanka time and time again. So in this context, I think the only remedy is that we should have a strong legal framework, and also we should enforce these laws against the wrongdoers to send a very strong signal that any wrongdoing in the financial market will not be tolerated. Now, for example, if you look at the CFA Institute, we have a very strong ethical focus. We are the, I would say, we are the only professional body which has a dedicated part of our syllabus in ethics. And after that, once you pass out as a charter holder, there's a continuing commitment for continuing professional education.
But don't you think that having the qualification is not enough, that professionals, I'm not talking only about your about CFA here, Dinesh, I'm asking in general, don't you think finance professionals need to speak out when they see a crime happening and not turn the other way around? Don't you think so?
Yes. So they
because studying ethics is one thing, acting it out is a totally different ball game, and I see that to be lacking in our capital markets.
Yes, people need to speak up. They need to stand up and tell when a wrong is being done. So that will be a strong deterrent. At the same time, those professional bodies also has a responsibility to society.
Correct.
They should hold their members accountable. So as a professional body, CFA has a very stringent disciplinary action process. So
and you think all financial bodies, or all, I would say, all such qualification bodies and all such financial associations or financial education associations need to have a similar disciplinary process?
Yes. So we are not only have a process, so we give severe penalties. So those who are convicted of serious wrongdoing, their charter is withdrawn, and this is a very public disclosure, withdrawal, and this very public disclosure. And after that, they cannot hold themselves out as CFA charter holders.
Understood.
So similarly, I think we should have a similar process in other professional bodies. They should have a disciplinary process, and wrongdoers should be publicly held accountable and punished for their wrongdoing.
The message must be sent across clearly.
Exactly.
Dinesh, thank you so much for joining us today. Wishing you and the members of the CFA Society of Sri Lanka all the very best, and good luck with your endeavors. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay. Thank you, Tarindo. My pleasure to be here today.
The role of capital markets and the current developments. This was the focus today on Bisnomics, and I will see you with the next episode. No matter what business you may be in, see how you could be a part of the action of capital markets, but as Dinesh said, make sure that you do your research first. Have a profitable week ahead.